All right. So as you know, as teachers, sometimes you think about what would be most effective and you change your lesson plan.
아니 number 2 다 롭티 칭에 지인배 차네 디텐덴 킹그레 뭐 당봉 아주 그 차시지디 아니야 디 가소레 유제 땅가 렉처 체고에 연구로 왔어.
And through what we did this morning, you were asking such good questions about the figures that we're not going to move on to the abstract. We really want to delve into what these figures are telling us.
다단기 쇼게 number 2기 아니 티와 두조가라 티와 단다 리모트 두조가라 티와 낭샤바 두조 빼야고도스 디 임버선자 다단다 저기 abstract 티가라 줘야 잡라 뭐라 아니 리모트라도스 디 책임스 되도록.
Before we look at the figures, we want to make sure that we're all clear on sort of the general main findings that were in this discussion paragraph.
ngala nga zogi da remote zo la tene ani zawe remote zo gi thanda ta nyedon khare tingge badi number changme gi de jegi kenyo badi nga zo jik di chegi yes shemba chegi yes.
Okay, so the first sentence is not a main finding, it is context.
다디기 측루 당보제로아 디 nyedon zo di maimba 갑종기 내수 갑제기 내수래도 아스콜.
And a key sort of indicator that it is context is it says the current study adds to a growing literature on the potential impact of meditation.
다디 갑제기 내수 갑종기 내수 땡기 예배 측디 라 단다 디나로라 아니 쿠란즈 예십 다 단대기 예십 디기스 아니 페게 로신베 아니 카르소랭아조 디 곰기 아니 슈게 토라 아니 좀쇼 라 페게 로신베딜라 아니 카르소 람데기 치고레 네베캬게 레슬란 티도아스.
The second sentence is very long and contains two main findings.
측루 니워저라 디나로라 측루 호라 링부시부체 엔디나라 녜드니 문진체샤스.
So I'll read the first part of that sentence, which is, although no main effect of compassion meditation training on innate immune, HPA, or behavioral responses to a stress was found.
디나로 녜드 당보디마 로바이나 라 아니 the 닝지 아니 정다처럼 정다디기 the innate immune da the HPA da any behavioral response 건조 군주기 야래 어디 아니 딱지 칸기 낭로라 슈 딱지 칸기 낭로라 다 아주 셈다 데베스 다 셈얘기 겐자도졸라스 안 코란 슈겐 제기요 바녀요 마르데스 라니티도아스.
And there's a lot of details in there, but then I wrote down sort of a simplified version of no main effects of compassion meditation on responses to stress test.
다디낭로라 십자망고 거요와 안디추 닝부도 뒤바이나 아니 딘데지기날 텐다 된 초고도 스캔라 코랑 데라 디티여스 아니 닝지기 아니 곰기스 아니 아주 셈게기 최다저와 디기 최다라 야렌데야딜라 슈겐 카야 민두스.
Now, if you don't know what a main effect is, this would definitely be a good thing to look up.
제가 건다 슈겐 말에디 코스레 아주 제부 라고레 개발하는 수민도 메인 이펙트는 표시해도 안 디게 다 된다 가르도 슬라바이나 아주 된다디 최고의 차시기레스.
But that usually means that you have multiple groups that you are comparing. And in this case, it's a control group to a meditation group.
다디게 된다디 아니 파게 코로나로라 슈겐도 망부예베 나로네 아니 제다바 직안 펜지 정도셔바 디잠 딘데 체베고서 슈겐메바디 고초그레스.
So this could easily be there was no main effects of a sutra meditation versus a tantra meditation on measures of EEG.
다 베네차샤바 넘버 2기 심주 체바지가 자르와이나 라 아니 이지기 다코 가조 장도라스 아니 도초게 디네 곰야다 가초 곰야라 아니 더 슈겐조디 민도스라니 템바나신데스.
So it's a term that's helpful for you for those of you who are doing experiments where you're comparing two or more groups.
다디 칙디로와 아니 심주기 낭로라 아니 지게 가르소를 가지고 ቄ로와 민다와 카시 배시 중도를 지기요나 딘데기 심주 낭로라 아니 칙디 개심 저와 차게 어레스.
A second main finding is within the meditation group, there's a significant correlation between the amount of meditation practice and innate immune and behavioral responses to stress.
tanyedun nibadi khares labaina an gom yagengi nanglo las ra ani gomgi da yunse ani mangyong gi thone ani sugula shugen thebiadi ani ngungi dos shugjen chijong kheba ngungi dos lan di res.
Right, so those are two key findings that we can write down. And as we start to look at the figures with Robin, we're going to see that some of these figures are directly related to these findings.
da dinni da karsore nyeden zo ni chagi yores ani jela da gen robin lagi remu ran la pha te ne di chi yundu an nyeden do zo remu na se ge yobade thong thog res.
So I think Nicole makes a really good point, which is linking text in the discussion section to the figures that are presented in the results section.
Tanji gen Nicole lagi da thanda thudur gi semba nanglo gi ani nangden da an remu ni chu jargo res la ni sungya di nenga chembo shu thong go dos.
And so what we want to do now is we want to go through and just try to understand these figures and use this as a teaching opportunity of how to read and how to navigate figures.
다 단당 아저기 아니 리모라 십 차고신이 때네 라 안디게다 리모게 낭된디 또야다 안디 고급디 아니 송베톤에 안자웨 리모라 코가 렌단다 아니 리무게 다칼소레 퇴행강된바디 세부 아니 신야게 다 고급로 송기스.
And so your task was to go through each of the figures and identify the question that was being examined in the figure, and then identify the answer that was being presented in the figure.
다 단다 디 튠디 낭로 라칸조기 최고야 디 카레스 라바이나 리모디라 때네 리모디기 아니코 티와 조 카리라 렌 최고도 디 지게 티와디 응지 제야다 데네 엔 티와디라 리모디기 렌 카리던 것도 디 응지 제야디스.
And what's interesting about Nicole's roadmap for reading an article is that it suggests that you actually don't need to know what TSTT is or what IL6 is when you're doing that first glance of the figure. It's just to get kind of a quick and understanding of the structure of the figure, that then you'll get more details as you go back and read the figure or read the paper.
당기 견라게 카르소레다 좀쇼 로단기 아니 sabtamasuna tembe kapsus ani tenda karsure jingaranso rewa chegosa lagore chechoegi tenda ro chikare dus labaina remona la shipchadus thangbongye ni shengo mares rabena chashawaina TSST gi cheta se da IL6 laiduzo mashin baina ya remola tawachamgi ani tenda khachi ngazu khothuye yores ra an tenzo koadi lensa ve jela ani shipja cheyundi ani chezom khorana lo ne an duzu sosogi tenda kharedo di ngazu tae yores.
And so now we just want to do this exercise together where we go through some of the central figures and just see if we're kind of getting the same questions and the same answers and maybe clarify any confusion that we have.
다 단당 아저기 리모딜라 때네 아니 리모디기 티와조 카레라 렌갸도 텐다 코랑기 렌디 카레샤디 따기 예스 라 창메기 따네 아니 아주 창말라 다 지게 티와다 렌 아니 다우다우 다 지게 레토바직 구글레스 라디메나 아니 논리셔사 카와레 직 세보 마차사 카와레도 딩아주 아니 데 요산체고도.
And so the structure here is that I'm going to ask you what the question is, and we're going to kind of bounce back and forth to see if we can get the right question. and then we're going to do the same for the answer. We're going to go through a few of the figures, and then we'll go back and kind of interpret them and more deeply understand them. But our first task is just to see if we agree on what the question and what the answer is for the particular figure.
ta thanda nga zu de remote di che en di je la remote ni sum ji gi nang lo la ra ani korang gi thiwa zo di khari imba di ngarang zo thumung gi thone khelen chi gi yung gu de da na shin leng gi thola ani thumung gi ani leng chi gi yung gu de di ngla la ta gi yes an di che sa we je la ani kyang zo gi thiwa zo pha khar so remote la la ya ani pheb ne ra ani ko thiwa zo nge sung che da leng ship sa wo nang cho gu res.
So what do you think the question that figure 2 is asking?
That remuni bachera dinanglo la ani thiwa khari la len chugi yasares di thiwa di khari yasares so So I think the question that this figure is addressing is the amount of time or number of sessions that each group is engaging in the meditation.
So the amount of time that each group is engaging in the meditation, okay? So let's unpack that a little bit. Does anyone else want to take an attempt to say what's the question that's being examined here?
So individual, the average of individuals, the average amount of time individuals spend on meditation.
Okay, so the average amount of time that individuals spent on meditation per week.
Per week.
Okay. I actually can't read this. I just want to make sure I average. Okay, average time and average session. Okay, great. So the average amount of time that people meditated per week, okay. What other information is in this figure? Good. So we have two pieces of information. One is the average amount of time that people are meditating per week, and then we also have the average number of sessions that people were engaging in 2 weeks, in a particular week.
Ta dinang lo la ani thoda su su gi ani gom che gi thuzoi di chanyom thuzoi khazoi imba chikta ani dunda chi gi nang lo la thunze do khazoi ra thoda su su gi yan thunze khazoi gi ringa la gom gya yo ba dini chene thiwa chimbu ni li gi dwas.
Okay. Anything else?
Ani shinda ge dwas.
So there's one really critical component to this figure that we've yet to identify.
Ta dinang lo la nenga chimbu gi thunda chik thanda nga zo gi ngun che ma sons.
That will help us interpret the subsequent figures.
Di ha ko ba ina ani chi su remote zo nga zo thende che la phengi res. Session mangyu. Session mangyu di thangi sungsa swa dunda chikla ani chanyom session khazu imba di the Karsura Tiwajik Resha Sunra. The Timaimbe Nanga Chimbugi and the Chikha Sunsur.
대 창매 곰 직바야 되래.
La
창매 곰 망뇽 직바야 되래.
Ale do, did all the participants engage in meditation about the same? Or is the amount of time that each participant spend on doing meditation is same or not?
So let me ask the question, how many groups were there initially in this particular study?
Di nanglo la thongma khurazu rugado khazo dosta. Nyamshu ching la. One.
Okay, there were two groups, right? There were people who were assigned to meditation and people who were assigned to the control group.
Dine rugani yores chikdi ko gom jange rugadi che ane shembadi tangzing rugadi.
Does that make sense? Right? Which participants is this figure addressing?
Dinini rugani ki nanglo ne remudi ki ruga khagi korla ani thenda tyungi SRS. The meditating group.
Exactly. So that's a really important part of this figure, is that this figure is only presenting data on the 33 participants who were assigned to the meditation group, who went through the compassion training group program.
The di thenda nenga chambu chagi resra the remudi ki thenda tye chirwa di ruga ni ki nanglo ne tanzi ruga ko la mares ra ko gom ningji gomking ki ruga chirwa di ki ani keju senenda di ki number tye res.
So is that clear that this is actually only presenting information on the people who are randomly assigned to the compassion training program?
The di nenga chambu res ra jada remudi ki ani kharsure kora di keju temba thenda temba di ani ruga ni ki nanglo ne gom yaken ruga chura gom yaken ruga di thangbo damdu ko rangar dambara random sine damba on di ki ani nisu tungi obadi shen go res.
And we can see that because in this sentence here, it says, in the 33 participants randomized to the compassion training who completed the study.
The remugi de all deje di nanglo le sevu jin tidwas ani ngazu random gi thone ningji gom khen gi rugana la ani shabe misumju soksum ki islani tidwas.
So what this figure is saying is amongst the people in the compassion training program who were randomly assigned to that particular program, how much did they meditate?
So that di gi kanje thoma ta nyamshu chinge mangbo nanglo ne ani khonzo ngazo ngeme ki thone misumju soksum ningji gomnge gi rugana la shabarwa. Di khonzo gi ta tunda chi gi nanglo la ani gom khazo kyasha thun khazo desha aslani di tunjo res.
Let's do one more piece of information on this just to be a little bit more precise in our description. How did the scientists in this study define time?
Ta tando ngazo teos chik shipcha su ani droba inas di nanglo la chiri bo chu ani thu di ani khandes chik ngunjin che shas la in minutes.
So maybe we can add how much average time as measured in minutes is each participant meditating in for the group. So you can see here, this is in minutes.
Tewa di da shipcha su tang ba ina ro ani konzo di nyamshu ba chu gi an tunda chi gi nanglo la chanyom ani gom gi yunse kama nang la ani khazus kyap shas la ne karma se chi di nyamba ina shipcha cheru du res.
So we'll come back to this figure and better understand what it tells us about the study. But I think we might all agree that this was a little bit of a complicated way to present this particular question.
Dang azu laria ani tuwa di la angela ani chi yone to ko karso tenda khandis kowa lengo do ding azu samtang chogures ta yimba ina thanda gi din nanglo la thiwa ki number tendang jera des chikta gonyok bosura ji chagdo was.
And what's complicated for you about in this figure?
kyanzula di khari gonyok be cha di khari reshas di remo di khandesin gonyok bore dos. It's hard to figure out the axis. Which axis to use?
Right, so there's two axes, right? There's an axis here, and there's an axis here, which is a little bit confusing.
제가 권역부 용에 찍디 코 슝티 니도아 아니 소소라 안기티도아 제가 슝티 가기랑 은진 최고래 디 제 권역부 용에 찍디 용도아
kelaa
나오 Another complicating factor was, it was not clear what each dot represents, whether it's representing the group or individuals. And I was thinking if it represents, or if it represented the individuals, then it must add up to 33. And I tried counting, and it's not adding up to 33.
Right, so one of the things that's challenging is that you see all these dots, you try to add it up, and it's not adding up to 33. Why do you think that might be the case?
제가 디 domna sumju sosum ligimendu sonroa di karjene malewa inas. Some may be overlapping.
Overlapping, exactly. Okay. There's one thing that was, for me at first, really confusing about this figure that you've kind of touched on. Anyone want to take an attempt at that? One more point?
No. Oh. Oh. Kama kazu chiringala gom gyaba di tungi ore Samsung's re. Ale di ki thanga di ki chungi yona phagi thanga di ki chungi yona di se umjo.
Mare sujo dilata tindi ane participant digi ane karma khaze ringa ju gom gyab ma gyab jira. Ta phagi dila dot medi sambala ta di gom gyamni digi karma sumda chega da sikya gu yona re yana di yora di sega din mundu le.
Di nga le sega mindu. Yala ki thiyo di. Also zimalai. Ta di participant digi. Ale tunda ge gap ine kama khazu gya this sewa gumindos. Okay, so his question is, it's not clear, this participant is we can infer that he has 8 sessions, but it's not clear how many minutes he has meditated.
So it may not be that a person on this corresponds to identically to the person on this.
Just digi that gyala ki sona dinala yebe midans phajo nangi mini takta gab ma chunga insa res the inchog res.
So for me it was confusing when I looked at this because initially my mind thought that they were comparing two groups. But you had to read deeper to say, oh, this is actually two different ways of presenting data on the same group, i.e. participants in the compassion study. And I found that a little bit confusing.
Gyala korang tes thangbo sebu macha di thangbo ta di ruga ni penju chungdur chigdo Samsungs. Jela ma lo yundi any ruga chiki nanglo la ani kunzu chungdur chesha bare doas. Jizan di ani karsure sebushta chungma songs.
Okay, so we've got this really well-defined question now, which is how much average time in minutes is each participant in a meditating group practicing meditation each week? How many sessions, on average, is each participant in the meditation group meditating each week? And kind of did all of the participants in this particular group engage in meditation about the same? And what's the answer to that question or to those questions? What's an answer that you learn from looking at this figure?
tanda kyanzugi tiwa sum tembarwa tiwa sum digi len khari insa res rimudela tane tiwa tangbodi khare dus lawaina tanda gomgi rugachi ra di nanglo la ani ko kharso nyamshuba regi kamanal zibaina chanyom tuzu gomgya tuzu khazore shas anibadi na tiwa nibadi ani kharsore tanda di ruka di nangis ani nyamshuba re dundachi ki nanglo la gom thun khazo chanyom gi thun khazo re shas antene tiwa sumbadi da nyamshuba changme ruka di nangi yobe nyamshuba changme an gom gya tuzu chikba kya dwes nani tiwa sumrwa.
And actually, Sandula, let's actually just ask each of these questions separately. So let's first just address this first question.
Jisa dang azu len kyanzu gi phagi remula sine tiwa tangbodi gi len kharre shasta chanyom gom gya gi chanyom tuzu kama nanglo la ziwaina khazo re shas.
So just looking at the figure, on average, how many minutes per week are people in the meditation group meditating?
Ta di ruga di nangi ge yebe mitsus ani dunda chigi nanglo chanyom tuzu khazo si gom gya shas.
Yeah, it's 20.
In there?
Yeah, 20.
Tell them to look at table 3.
Exactly. That's where I was looking to. That's me.
This is per session.
Practice time per at-home session. It's unclear to me if this is a slightly different question.
Yeah, this is the total of 8, so it's not quite
So why don't we just take a best guess here? You can kind of just get a general sense, maybe point your finger.
Ta kya ngazu tsuba ro chena ro kwas chanyom di khazo sinsa resta.
Yeah, about 50 somewhere in here for minutes, right? Where would you tell me to put my finger for number of sessions?
Ta di kharsore chanyom tuzu di chebaina kamang ab just ro cherwa ta di yunse chanyom yunse chebaina khazo sinsa resta. About 4.
Okay, so the answer to the first question is about 50 minutes. The answer to the second question is about 4 minutes.
Tiwa tangbe lendi kamang ab juse tiwa nibe lendi tunshis.
And for the third question, what's the answer to our question of did all the participants in this meditation group do about the same amount of meditation?
And tiwa sumbe lendi khari insare esta khanje nyamshuba changmegi ani gom gya gi tuzu di chikba to red west la edila.
No, and that's really helpful for us understanding the upcoming figures, right? A critical take-home here is that not all the participants in the meditation training program did the same amount of meditation.
Ta dinenga chimbu chagoyo res je langa zu remote zu koa lembe kapsu ra digi ani kharityongi dos lawaina ina koran zu gom gyakhengi ruga rede ra dinangi nyamshuba changmegi gom gyasegi yunse di chikba memba da tunse di chikba memba.
Okay, let's go on to the next figure. So here we have a figure with a couple different panels of data. What do you think is the question that this figure is addressing?
Ta di remote nanglo la ko kharsura nga zo tsemba do khashish dwas ani di remote gi ani tiwa kharila lein kyagi yonas. Karin ya. It seems like the question is, what is the difference between the two groups in terms of the levels of these chemicals after they have taken the TSST test?
Perfect. Let's add one nuance to that. So Sangpala said in reference to these chemicals, do we want to add any nuance to that?
Tadi tanda ngazu tad chemicals lane je
What's that?
slarwa
Yeah.
dila shibjado khari tuingsa res la mood okay, perhaps we mention emotional distress
Exactly.
score.
So what's the difference between how the groups, so here now we are talking about groups, control group and compassion training group. What's the difference in how they responded to this TSST stress test in both their self-reported mood and in these two chemicals? Great interpretation.
저 ngazu shibjato chene ani tiwadi ta tiwadi ndechila len yunguyo ba tiwad ta ngazu tiwadi ndechin ngonzi chena digidoas ani ta rukani yorwa gomjange da tangjing rukani gi nanglo las ani chedadi TSST gi chedadi chebe jesus ra ani quran ju gi sugu nanglo la zegi khebar thans quran ju gi nyongwa pha ani she shabe ta nyongwa la ani khebar dos lane.
So let's tweak this just a touch. Instead of saying how this affected these two chemicals, maybe we can say what those chemicals are.
Tadi tandu shibja cherudone ani zejors la di laya gi chabla Quran ze Quran ngun sumbaina ani se tu durwas.
So what are the two chemicals that were measured here? You don't have to know what they mean, but you can just reference what they're actually reporting on the axes of the figures.
Da chenje chiagi ze ni de karre shas kyanzo gi ze re ne mashin bai ne kyo mare ina ya remodela ta indu ze khari ta karre shas.
Great.
IL-6 and cortisol.
So maybe we can just instead, chemicals, we can say IL-6, cortisol, and then self-report.
Tadi ngazu chishe do main bachine ani phage chenje sheyagi zechachoro di ngosu ani dela labne ra IL-6 ta cortisol che antene ngazu semkham gi ta susu gi nyongwa sheba.
Now, there's another really important aspect of this figure that I think is important for us to understand as it pertains to the question that the reviewers are assessing.
Tande da di remote gi numbers ne da keju shen chi gi ta ngazu tanda tiwa di ta jawa chaya chi thongdos.
So, the vertical axis or y-axis is pretty clear. We've addressed that. We've got self-report, POM, self-report emotional distress. We have IL-6, which is a measure of inflammation, and we have cortisol, which is a hormone. So we've got that.
Tanga zu shungti ki remote soso gi shungti khang ibadi sewu chaswas magi wodi imbaina su semkham gi nebab ta khande yume khansa thoda soso gi labya di che ani niba pardi na IL-6 laidi nyense ro khazu gesha digi cheshi di che tene cortisol laidi ngazu menshare menze ro digi cheshi chine shungti gi du sewu chaswas.
The x-axis, this horizontal axis, actually has a lot of information that we want to understand to fully understand what the researchers, what question they were assessing.
Tedi jora tedi dinalola ya nechu mangbu shibuji yores dinga zu hakoba ina konzu da 심주 징에 쪽이 아니 심주 가리 된다 가리 쪽이 여봐 녀된 가리 임바 딜라 아니 고아 아니 대행기 다 nechu mangbu yores dina.
So what is this gray bar here?
디 당아주 꺄도 소르지도 디 나리디 카르레 공거도스 라 가르친게요 나스디 라 it's the time when this test is applied.
Beautiful. So this is the time in which the TSST is applied. The TSST is the Trier Social Stress Test. So this is the amount of time in which the Trier Social Stress Test is being administered.
제가 티까디 지도 나리디기 가르친게를 슬라바이나 건조 단다디 저기 샘게 꿀제기 최다지로와 디 뒤저 가족이rin가라 아니 건조 디 귤 드로이바 디 충겨 레스트 뒤저디.
And what are the numbers here on this horizontal or x-axis refer to?
테디 강기 안기지도 안기디 가르친게요 레스 안기디기 된다 가르스. 라 time minutes.
Minutes, exactly. And so what this is, does anyone want to kind of try to understand what this is being plotted here in minutes and with this gray bar? What's the question that the researchers are asking with all of that additional information?
다단데 저 세가디 뗀사비 제라 아니 심주바 추기 데라 티와티에디 가리 인사레스타. 단데 티까디디기 고 셈게 구제디체 아니 월라터 티제 뗀샤도아 딜레 아주 더 티와 가리도지 건조기 천대유베 티와도 가리를 인사레스타 디기스. TSS test the ale so the experimenters or researchers were trying to find out after how long after the application of the test do we see the effect of the meditation?
Okay, so how long after the test do we see the effect on these variables? But there's also another really rich piece of information in this figure that is not just what happens after, but what happens before, right? So you can see that they measured these variables before the TSST, and then they measured these variables after the TSST.
제가 디나로 세가 세대 내주 세대 지가래도 슬라바이나 단다 gen하게 송원의 시진에 파게 최다세오로디 셈게 꾸제디 계사회 제라 아니 유와카르도고도 직체 아니 셴바디 디 카스로가 저 테스트 마체응라 라 아니 아 코랑기 네밥 카르도 디 리모디게 뜬거도 하스디나를 내수딩 아주 레야도 와스.
So what this is allowing us to do is to examine time and the effect that the TSST has on these variables over time, before and after.
디기 아주 가리 내수 런토고 레슬라바이나 TSST기 저다체로와 디기 아니 도줄라 슈겐 칸데스 택비도 와 마충을라 칸데도 중사회 제라 슈겐 칸데스 두고도 디
So given this really important part of the figures, does anyone want to take an attempt at refining or kind of updating our question to take into consideration this important variable of time?
So Grace thinking perhaps the question would be, what is the difference between the change in these variables before and after the TSS test is applied?
Perfect. So what's the change in these variables before and after the TSST? There's one additional layer on top of that, which perhaps we could write the question, what's that? I'm sorry. What was that? Oh, yeah. So perhaps we could phrase the question, are there differences in how the compassion training group and the control group respond to the TSST stress test, right? Are there differences in how these two groups respond to this particular stress test? And the reason why we're able to ask that question is because we have a measurement before and we have measurements after.
당아주 단다디 스트레스디 카르소레 컨조 만용은다 아니 제기 내추 여버 송자스 디나로 아주 티워치 카리 티스 초그레스 라바이나 라 곰 야켄기 루가디다 당징 루카니 디기스 파게 최다디 제용디 텔라 야렌 트레단라 케바드 웨스라니 디 티워치 아주 티초그레스.
Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so can you see how important time is in this particular figure, before and after, or what we often call in research pre-post, pre-TSST versus post-TSST?
디기 나로라 다 뒤디 라 케침보 가져이 뭐지 땡게도 와스 라 아주 심주게 나로라 뒤기 나로라 아니 마충배 응원다 충외 제스라네 응원제기 아니 디 한내가 심부직 자기어레스 니줄량야라.
Okay, so let's answer this question. Let's start with cortisol. Are there any differences in how the compassion training group and the control group respond to the TSST stress test on cortisol?
나중에 티와디다 티와디기 랭 가르던 게 도스파기기라 당보 코르솔랑 라테바이나스라 아니 디기 다 세시디라 컨트롤 단다 당진 루가다 아니 가르솔 곰기 루가 드니니라 아니 지게 단다디 스트레스 테스트 아니 가르솔에 중외제 마체병원다 제기라 케바 가르던 게 도스라 다 케바 가르도스에 티와디라 코르솔라 자나 랭 가르레샤스 라 there isn't much difference.
There's no difference, right? And they actually say that in the little figure caption. There's no difference in the compassion training group or the control group in how they respond to the TSST as measured by cortisol.
제가 더 코르솔 기토네 제외 값수스 아니 루가드니니라 semngege choda ani karsore choda la yalentre dila kheba mindus kheba mebadi ngaju thonggu dwas. So if we look at dela.
Yep, beautiful. And that's
there may be some difference.
So that's a great point, is that it looks like there might be a difference, right? It looks like the compassion group might be a little bit higher here, right?
So that remote run a table in a page tanda gom yaking rugajura, niji gomking rugadil test, chike called seshi di toayova, kabatamoyova tongo was.
But this is why statistics are so useful, because even though it looks like there's a difference here between the compassion training group and the control group on cortisol, statistically, there is no difference.
아주 낭수일라와 아니 군인이 발라 개바지 여바서지 낭기여데 이나야 타지 체온데 아니 든이니라 개바메바 아니 된게요레스 디 무슨 다든데 장도 27배 가수 타지 디케이션부 가수 심바디 And
just to be clear, they say very precisely in the figure caption that there are no differences statistically. So you can always reference the figure caption, that text right below the image, to make it clear that whether there are or there are not differences.
뒷잠도 마세 애니 콘주기 단다 리모 월라 가장 스티기로 디낭로라 아니 단다 코르솔라 투두 케바카에 녜마 순슬라네 쿠란조기데 트레샤스 제자 카브레 마게 데셰디기야 리모딜 코알레야라 펜도 용그레스.
But this is a good teaching moment on the importance of statistics, of actually measuring, even though our eyes might say this group is bigger or higher than this group, statistically, these groups are not significantly different from each other. And that's one of the reasons why we do statistics, is to see if those differences are significant.
당아란즈 미기 따연디 로 케바 여버스로 통고어와 때 이마이나야 파게 타시 낭로라 아니 루가니기 찬염다도 도리온디 로 아니 nenga 징기 다 케바직 얘기요 말레스.
And one more point on this. One of the ways that I often kind of visually will tell whether an effect is statistically significant or not is whether those error bars that Nicole was referring to when she was teaching on this, whether they overlap. And here you can see there's a lot of overlap. So that suggests that these are not significantly different from each other.
다 딘데기 디 아니 제말라 타지 케침부 가주임베 디기 아니 저게 심발라 랍구구요나 라 페센트 저기 펜도 첨부도 왔 데네 군인이기 케바디 nenga 첨부 메바디 찍디 라 쿠란치다 소소기 디네 세시디 템바레데 이나양 아주 노르쪽이 타삼지와 타삼디나 군인이 널데도 왔 지삼기 널체와 대초기 군인이 바로 케바 nenga 징기 케바메바도 고두구레 제자 딘널이야 딜레 따초고레스.
So now, take a moment to read the figure caption if you haven't already, and that'll give you the answer of whether or not there's any differences between the compassion group and the control group on this IL6 variable.
다 디네 IL6라 케바 쇼르도 민도스라니 타이나 캔즈르물라 타이네 케바 루고도 민도 직시 안 디네 마기 월라 카잔디 나로라 카리티샤디 직시다스.
And so, is there any difference in how the groups respond to the TSST on IL6?
제가 IL6 기 세실라 때바이나스 아니 루가니기 야렌트단딜라 케바 시기드베스.
So we know that there's no significant difference between the groups on IL6 because it says very directly that there's no main effective group on these particular outcome variables. So we can infer from that the two groups do not differ on IL6.
다디 가르소레 가장 코랑기 나로라 라 아니 두줄라 다 규르체 두줄라 케바 민도스라니 아니 송바나 신체네 라 아니 IL6 기 최시 때바이나야 루가 두니니라 nenga 체베 케바케 요마레스.
Okay? So let's read that sentence again before we interpret this last figure, which is the palm's mood. So I'm going to read the following statement. No main effect of group, compassion meditation versus control, and no group by time interaction were found for cortisol or palm's emotional distress or responses to the TSST.
다디 양양 아주 디 로바이나 디나 로라 카리코도 슬라바이나 라 아니 단다디 제두주기 가서 세시네다 아니 봄스 샘감기 아주 그런서 야렌데 딜라 루가니기 곰체버디기 개방운구 민도슬라니 티도 왔으나.
And the reason why I reread that is because this figure is a little weird, because when I first looked at it, I thought there was a group effect, or more technically an interaction, but I'm not going to get into that. I thought there was a group effect, but I had to read the figure legend, that text below, to make it clear that it wasn't.
다 게나 코랑 당보따디르와 숨바치르와 다 미수수기 샘감기 네버 라베디라 루가니라 케바 쇼르도 삼니 텐손스 이나야 워기 카잔디 로용디 아니 케바 메바직 디 티샤스 니니 바라라 케바 메바지.
So let's look at this figure a little bit more closely. Right here before the TSST, is there any difference between the two groups on mood?
최다 마치베 셈게 최다 마치베 루가니라 케바 통고드베스티. 듄라.
Okay.
No.
Now, they did a very nice method here where they measured this mood as measured by the POMS after the TSST. Does it look like there's a group difference on the POMS measure across the two groups after the TSST?
다 semgi karchoda di chechabe jelas ra ani rugani di ki semkham gi ta nebab dela kheba yoba jiksigi do estinalola.
It looks like it. But if you read that figure caption below, it says no main effective group. And it says there's no main effective group for all three of these variables.
다 ngazu dus tawa ina da kheba yoba suraj thonggo do ina oge ani khajan dela teba ina ani kheba thongma sonslani tishas.
So what that's saying is that even though it looks, this goes to Gaelick's point earlier, even though it looks like the two groups differ here, statistically they're actually not different. And that's where statistics is useful for kind of clarifying whether something is significantly different from each other.
제가 단다디 갈소래 ngaranzu nangzudi yorde inaya 타지기 아니 거 예십 제연도 로아디 툼데 군인이라 아니 장제저라디라 냉가체에 개발민도스라이지 등급도 와스 제단디 단기 계획에 송번나시 ngaranzu 미기 통연도 개발요바 통바 이나야 타지기 람네 아니 개발 매버지 땡기요도 타지기 예십디 하장기다 개침부인바 아디네네 가지고 코토고도 와스.
And one glimpse that we can get into that is that those error bars that Nicole was referencing the other day have some overlap. So that suggests that they're kind of not different enough to be significantly different from each other. There's a lot of error in the data.
dine 아주 직디로 개발 매버 따야 직디 군인이기 아니 칼소래 아주 노리하기 체도지로 단잠 눈인이 직는데도 와스 너기 여보 손자스 아니 디 개발디 라 아니 칼소래 개발디 nenga 친구 임바 nenga 지수 아니 미룬와 임바디 안데네는 아주 고토그레스.
So the answer to our question that Nicole has written up here is that there are no statistically significant differences in how cortisol, IL-6, or this emotion measure, POMS, change in the compassion and the control group before and after the TSST.
다디 인디 당 아주기 딜라 랭 카르레도스 티와드즈라 랭 카르레도스라 랭 티베 컵수스라 아니 타지기 고네스라니 라 타지기 고네 아니 루가니기 라코 생게 최다 마체바다 아니 제베 제수스 아니 코르티솔다 IL6 제 아니 폼스키 다 체시 두줄라 아니 nenga chewe kheba mindus라니 아디 다 레모드즈기 땡겨레스.
Now, there's just one last point I want to make on this figure because it's important in understanding this figure legend, the text right below figure 3.
The wall, the remogi wall, the conjugi desestikwa, the karsure, any kazusi, nenga chimbu imba, roa dine, tenda mangbu kazus lian yobadi, and it's a tuyangi chedo genlagi tenda chik yanga shunde chonsons.
In this statement says the Trier social stress test, or the TSST, increased plasma concentrations of cortisol, IL-6, as well as the POMS emotional distress score.
The word la karite do lava ina, any semge get cheda tier gi semge cheda digis.
It's just the first sentence.
Tier gi semge cheda digis, any kasungazu tagi nanglola, any cortisol da, any IL-6 che, and the name Koranzo Pomski and the Tizegi lamne, that same come gi never dozu, any toro tangioba, toro tangio reslani, cheda di che undi mitsugi. And
what that is saying is that this Trier social stress test was successful in increasing cortisol, increasing IL-6, and increasing emotional distress across all participants in the study.
아니 cortisol 기 체체 IL6 체 아니 파게 semkham 기 never 기 체도조 토로 당겨봐. 로 창매기 규라 파게 냠슈싱의 창매기 규라 토로 당겨봐. 디 아니 뜬기도 왔어.
But as we've concluded, the groups themselves did not significantly differ in their response to this TSST. So even though the TSST increased these metrics of stress, there were no group differences in how they responded to the TSST.
더 샘게 최다디기 코란 차와 최고에디 아니 제야라 라타 람론 중와 tum제 여바디 아주 통바와 임바이나야 델라 야렌트 연디 루가니라 케바메바디 tum제기 뜬기도스.
Okay. So this is now where things get a little bit exciting and a little bit interesting in this particular study.
다 리모디 나다 심주디 낭로라 아니 아주 카르수레 어다 심주기 tum제디 카르수레 튼제 여바직 아니 뜬켄기 리모직 레스 디 아주 통하다 셈라 가초르게.
So my first question is, who are the participants that are plotted in this figure?
제가 당보디 라다 단다디 리모 나로라 네츠이 망고지 뜬샤라 디 네츠디 수기 네츠레스 냠슈바 가기기 네츠레스 meditation group.
Okay.
The meditation group.
And how many people are plotted in this figure?
디나로 미카즈 청구도스다. 7 33
33. And we know this because if we read that first sentence of the figure legend, which is the text right below figure 4, it says, in participants randomized to compassion meditation, N equals 33.
다디 숨주 속숨 여바디 아주기 워기 가자디니 로와이나 시간 당보 코나낭로라 로 아니 닝지 곰게 닝지 곰 아니 정다 책행기 냠슈바스 아니 장가디 제도와스 숨주 속숨.
So, as a reminder, we have no group differences between compassion training and control group at the kind of mean effect or the group effect.
땅 아주 탱고에 찍라 셈랑에고에 찍라 로 아니 가르소레 no difference
No differences on those other variables that we just discussed at the group effect. There were no group differences on those particular
루가
variables.
펜주인 도르윤디스 아니 셈게기 최다딜라 야렌 쩌단치로아 코코리슬기 세시다 IL6 세시도 저기 토네 케바메바디 당긴 아주 리몽원들라 통송하스.
But the researchers made a decision at this point, and they say, okay, we don't have group differences between the compassion training group and the control group, but let's look within the compassion training group to see if there might be some meaningful relationships to help us better understand our data.
됐다 디참라 아니 건조 심주징에 고란족이 타주시 제네 라 땅진 루가다 아니 곰 야갱 루가니라 루가기 아니 찬염가라 두리온디 케바 민두스 라 케바 토요마라 때이네 가족이 곰 야갱 코라낭로라 라 아니 케바 윤구도 민두스라니 아니 따기 예스 디 아니 따발라 때네야 심주디기 가족라 네주 사바 가르테기도스라니 딘데 타주시 제네 아니 건조기 디 예십디 제레스.
Before we ask the question of what this figure is addressing, let's just take a moment to understand the structure of the figure.
다 가족이 디 리모디기 티와 가리라 랭갸고도 랭트고도 슬라니디 저도 마체뱅어 라스 알링엘라 리모코랑기 꼬바 칸데지레샤 디지게 따기 인스텔라.
This figure is a scatter plot. We've talked about that term at different points in the research training workshop over the years.
디게다 단다디 갈소레 아주 장도 뗀다지라 리모디 나로라 딜라 아니 토리스라니 더 스캐터 플롯 라이 디레스 띵망 아주 저도 제사바임바스.
And this figure is often good at examining the relationship between two variables within a particular group.
딘데게다 스캐터 플롯 토리지라 디 루가 찍바찍이 나로라 아니 계조민다와 니 펜주 충돌 제바이나
So when I first look at this figure, it's pretty clear to me that they're not looking at group differences, they're looking within a group to see whether or not two variables are related to each other.
다 리모디 통화단 게라 코란 게 셈나 다 디나로 루가니 충두 제바 마레샤슬라니 람산 렌 코알렌 투고요 레스 루가 찌기 낭로라 다 케주민다와 니 충두 지겨바디 리모 코란 통화다 코알렌 투 레스.
This is, as we know, the X or horizontal axis, and it's plotting the average number of sessions that a participant is engaging in meditation per week.
다 워게 테딕저와 테디디 디 가르던 것도 슬라바이나 라 아니 둔타 찌기 낭 둔타 레이 낭로라스 아니 곰갸야기 카르소레 튠세저라 튠망용기 세디임바 가지고 고토고도 와스.
And on this vertical axis is they're plotting IL-6, which is this measure of inflammation.
데네 슝티디 콘조기 IL-6디 디기 NHCD 샤샤 슝디간.
And what does a larger number mean on this axis?
디나를 장가 채와요나 고아 가리 랭고레스 장가 채와디기 가리 충기레스. More
Exactly.
IL-6.
So a higher number here means that there's higher levels of inflammation in a particular person.
tanda IL-6 다 파기 장가체 디 가르충기레슬라나 IL-6 기 보르세디 체와체 디라디 아니 수구나로라 냥가 년세기 야렌디 토아요 바팅거레스.
And what does the higher number on this axis mean?
다 상디 디 낭로라 장가 토아디 가르충기레스. 라 session kare.
Yeah. They're participating in more meditation sessions per week.
More sessions, yeah.
So with that understanding, what's the question that this figure is addressing?
tadi ngazo ngi chesawe jelas ani remodi ge da thiwa kharila len gyagodos. La tunda jila ten gazo gong gyagye ba. So tiwadi tadi tiwa kharila len tungu dos tadi tiwa remodi gi tiwa khande chi gi len chagi dos. Okay, so what is the effect of the number of sessions per week on the level of IL-6?
Okay, so what is the effect of the number of meditations per week on IL-6? Okay, so let's refine that question a little bit, let's refine that question just a little bit. So what's one piece of information that would be important to clarify or refine this question?
tadi tiwadi kyanzo tiwa karsore phage remola te ne tiwadi ro ta tiwadi ngazo shipcha su tangbaina ro khandes tangsa res di ne chu khari gi tiwadi shipcha su tang dos ne ju pharma khari gyabaina tiwadi test shipcha su dosa res na TSST testi only the ale remodina segide remodinangi shipchachik nembe thone and tiwadi noru khandes tangi bas la ale okay, perhaps we add that it's the same group that we are comparing within the group.
Beautiful. That's exactly what I was going for. So our first task here is to say who are the participants that we're examining this relationship within. So maybe we could say among participants who were randomized to the compassion training workshop or program, and then we can say the rest of it. Okay, so
yep.
we need to identify who the participants are that we're examining this relationship, and we know it's just the compassion training participants.
the shipchan ne noru tang chik di shipcha di kharesna kharsore phage cheba chesa jora di suim bangun jin che di ra di ndi je ningji gomkhen gi rukha di nanglo las lani di shipcha di ne bai nasla.
So somebody was mentioning, I think Calden, I heard you say the phrase TSST. So how might that refine our question here?
that TSS 단지 semngegi dichwa choda seguro ta di digal contest nungi best di nne ngazu di noru contest angres.
Yep. Say. Exactly. So one thing we could do to refine our answer here is to say the effect of the number of meditation sessions per week on IL-6 after the TSST. That's important because we're not just measuring baseline inflammation or IL-6, we're measuring IL-6 in response to the TSST, right? So that's important to clarify.
That the shipja chikdi ra ani semnge choda di chebe ani semnge choda di na shugrini ani shugbe kamang gubju jesus lani ani shipja di nemba ina kansana shenda ngazugi tiwa di mati ba ina chidang korangi ani cheshi khazure do jegi baso chitini bara keba khariyo ba di jegi baso chirwas di mares tanda dela koran baseline di maim bachene choda di je chungwe jesu ani kunyi bara keba kharido slani di chogo rwas.
There's one more change I'd like to make to this question that's a little advanced and a little nuanced. And it has to do with the word effect.
Ta gyalagi tande digala shibja yangya chik nende dos ra di tos chik tawas ro chagres and di phage effect lan nubas la jiro ashuken se didan tebe ani didan tewa yores.
So in your studies in Buddhism, you spend a lot of time talking about cause and effect, right? The relationship between causation and outcome. So what might be a little bit off about using the phrase effect to describe this graph?
Number 2 susu karso renganzo de nangche nanglo la jang gyunde ko la jang ne ro ani gyudi gi ani debu dinde keres lan labge roas chidan thanda effect la di debu karso renganzo da gyu kebe debu slani ro ta dela ngazo shipcha kharitem ba ina da ko ngoine su lagora di sewa chasa res.
Beautiful. Who said correlation? Or you don't have to raise your hand. What does correlation not mean?
Tanda de tunde ki ani koa tanda khari mares ta tunde ki tunde is la in the khari mares.
It's a weird question. Exactly. So in science, we often say correlation does not mean causation.
Ta tseri ki nanglo la ani tunde di ani kharso gyunde tunde ki dewa de gyunde ki dewa mares labgi ores tigo mares.
So we'll talk about the answer, but from this plot, we can measure the relationship between meditation sessions and IL-6, but given the nature of this design, we can't establish which variable causes the other. So we just have to talk about correlations or associations.
Da tanda di nanglo la da keje ni slaura keje ni para la dewa kharido di tembarwas ina ya dindegi dewa di gyundegi dewa imba ro keje chigi keje shemba di kigi yoba o di shimju khorangi nanglo la thengyo mares.
So let's answer this really interesting question, the question that's posed here. What's the answer to this question?
Da tanda di tiwa di gi len khari insares phage remote la tene correlation di khare redo tiwa di redo la inverse.
So one way to answer this question is exactly, there's an with the word inversely. So let's put that into a sentence. How would we put that into a sentence as we answer this question?
Tadi dongre redo slide sik di pheche chene ani len koran chazan ji gyabna khandes gyapsa res. Nam yu tiwa na la tiwa khari na ko len chega di tiwa na la yorwa on di pheche ta ne ani dongre se di khandes nungim be. Among participants in the compassion meditation group,
good.
And there is.
So we have among participants in the compassion meditation group, good, we always want to clarify that. There is an inverse correlation.
Inverse correlation,
between, perfect called in, between
between the number of meditation sessions per week.
Yep. Nice thing at this point is you can just copy the rest of the sentence, right? It's right there.
And
That's a really good answer. Okay? Let's do one more thing with this. Let's say you were communicating this at a community event and you wanted to make this answer a little bit more accessible to people who may not know the phrase inverse correlation. So how could we word this in a way that's a little bit less statistically jargony? That's being statistically jargony. How can we word this in a way that's a little simpler, a little clearer?
Tadi karsa ta mikyumachi la kyanzu tumde de shegyagu yonas ra ani sik tanda inverse correlation ani karso dogbe tunde se duzu labaina kuguma ras chizan tos chik tab dero the sedo da kollaru khandestangim bas. The compassion meditation decreases the.
Okay, I love that. With one exception, the phrase decreases implies causality, right? So we have to be careful in our wording.
Ta digi ma nyungdo tangba res lawaina ko jundegi dewa de kosisa roas. This also nango res.
So maybe what's that? I'm sorry.
May decrease.
Okay. Even may, there's a slightly different wording. Here, how about this? Among participants in the compassion meditation group, the more a person meditates, the less inflammation they have. The nice thing about that wording is it doesn't imply causality, it just recognizes that these two variables are associated.
Tos lela rutan kodero tanya las ani ruga digi nanglo la ani gom mangwa ani jakhen choge nanglo la ani di nyunga dos lane ra IL6 nyunga dos labaina ani ko junde ke ko gumares tong gumares.
So it's exciting for me because we can kind of see how the logic of Buddhist ideas of causation are also applied to science, where we have to be very precise and careful with our causal wording.
Cheza da nangshe nanglo la ani junde di ta nenga chimbu zigi ona shin chenri gi nanglo la junde nenga chimbu zi ne koni dewa di ani junde gi dewa la ni karso re zigi yo ba di nga zu dene ne ha gu do as.
So there's a really exciting point. There's a really exciting take-home point in this study.
Da simju di nanglo la ta ngaran zu ge semla ni nyar ta karsore semla ji karsore ke ni yana dene ne ker choya gi ani thene chik yongo do was.
And that spread really matters. Okay. So for me, I think this is a really exciting point and also resonates a lot with what you all have taught me about Buddhist practice.
Da di nanglo la thunda chik gyala khorangi ta samlo dangda na chambu chik chambu chag dos di number 2 gi ya su su karsore lomnye gi nanglo la yang na yang do gongba she chik res.
So this figure tells us how much on average people meditated in minutes, or how much on average the number of sessions that people attended per week.
Ta remodi nanglo la nyamshu cheken su gi dunda chike nanglo la gom khazus kama nal chi ba ina gom khazus kya gi yoba kya yoba yana thungi nal chi ba ina dunda re la thunse khazu yoba di tung do was.
And this is only amongst the people who are actually in the compassion meditation group.
Di any ruga ni gi nanglo ne gom kya ge nyingji gom khen gi ruga di any nyamshu ba surwas.
The kind of boring answer is just the mean, that these people have about this many minutes per week and these people have about this many sessions per week. That's important, but it's not that interesting.
Ta di kharsor khazu gya go do lai len di ani chanyom la ta ne ani chi gi chanyom la digis kya go do thunse digis ani cheshas la ne di thiwa di chedan da ko kharsor nga zo ne chu tegi orde ina ya di nga zo kharsor yiwan thokbo do ke min do as.
So what is an interesting insight about this study and about the participants in this study that we learn from this figure?
다 디네 아주 토낭 레비아디 카르레샤스 다 냠슈바디 주기 아니 카르소레 디낭기 냠슈바디 주기 다 제단 단다 콘조 곰갸이 뒤주디 데테라디 아주 텐달 토낭 레비아 토낭 숭켄디 아니 카르레샤스 다 디나
I'm going to do this until somebody answers it. What's that?
There is a difference within the group.
Beautiful. There's a lot of what we would call variation within the group about how much people are practicing. Not everyone is doing the same amount of practice. There's what we would call spread or variation within the compassion group, how much people are practicing.
Di kharedo slavaina ta gom jakengi ruga khora nanglo la ya gom jaya mangyung da thunse mangyung gi khebar chimbu shujik shogi changme gi chikba jagi meba khebar chimbu yobadi reshas.
So you can see some people aren't practicing at all, right? They're very low in their practice, both in maybe their minutes and in their sessions.
Khashegi ro ani gom shira gmindo was ta phages
Where some people are practicing a lot. I mean, this person's a practitioner. They're doing 200 minutes a week of meditation. They're really engaged in this training program. And my sense is that when the researchers looked at this figure, they said, oh, there's a lot of variation. Maybe we should look at within the compassion training group to see if those who practice more have the effects. So combining our knowledge of the fact that there's a lot of variation in how many minutes or how much people were practicing with this particular figure, which is an inverse correlation that we've now gone through, what's an important insight that we can learn from this study?
단기 갈소레 루가 낭노라 케바 침부 시우지 여바 직체 아니 코란즈 낭쿠 충두르 시연데 잠발라 딘데기다 제와 여바디 녜바디기스 아니 나줄라 지 고토 마스나 녜셰 사바 카리 징기도스타 고토 사바 카디나로 네주 사바 카리 신야도스 if we increases the length of practice, then there will be larger effect.
Exactly.
Larger correlation.
So you all have said to me a number of times that you can't understand Buddhism by reading sutras or reading wiki pages about Buddhism. You actually have to do the practice. In this paper suggests exactly that in order to see the positive benefits of meditation on, say, inflammation or these other metrics, you actually have to engage in it. You actually have to practice it. You have to strengthen the muscle of meditation in your mind in order to see the positive effects on the body.
Di tunda di ta zomsho digi tengi ores ra kesi ani gom chebala niji gombala tenne anduzu karsore nyungdu tangoya da shugyen sangbo di töngu yona ko gomgi gyunung bu jagoya di jabala tenne susugi gomgi da gomdan jewa yebe ani karsore nangi chagendu shukchero tongoya di töngu was.
But let's take a moment to put on our critical hats. Right? So think about Buddhist causation or logic or debate. So I just said the following statement. The more a person meditates, the lower their inflammation.
당아주 카레 디 togowe shamuro di khones antila teba inas ta genlagi joba dindiji sungba ina 아니 곰 가수 망와 자와 티츠기스 아니 IL16인에다 디마인베 자차도조 아니 뉴와 차그레스라니 조바디 숨바이나.
But we just talked about how correlation does not equal causation. So how do we need to be a little bit more careful here in our conclusion?
제가 단기 가서 뜬데 여바sam기 코 준데 임바디 고구마로아스 인고구마로아스 멤버 손자다 디 저바디 코랑기 녜된처럼 녜된디 아니 컨테스트네 마 뜬사레스. So you want them to
or
come
what
up with
might
a
be
statement?
even an alternative explanation for understanding these data that don't involve more meditation being associated with lower inflammation? Yeah, it's complicated. Let me just
to interpret
I'll just give you the example and then we can work off of that. One possibility is that there's something about these people that just have low inflammation, that they're just maybe responsible, conscientious people who have good diets, or there's something about them that it's not really meditation driving this, it's just some other variable, or what we would call third variable in research that's describing this association.
다 단대 가지고 녜디 덴데지 녜바레 데스와 직체나 로 단다 카르소레 아일세 뉴뉴용에기 미드조이나 쿠란주기 세제 된다이네다 파여 된다기 토네 뉴와 차인데 꼭꼭 검라 카야 저메버든데 용초로 왔어.
I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that whenever we're dealing with correlational data, we need to be cautious about making really causal claims. And so what we could do here is we could do a future research, a future study to follow up on this that involves an experimental manipulation that would really allow us to test whether meditation and the amount of meditation affects the immune system like they're showing here in this correlation.
제가 당긴디 로 개발쇼에 디 코란족이 아니 베나 세제 된다로 지기 임바이나로 아니 규체 숨바지 규다 숨바지 레로다 곰다 디니니 마이베 규다 심바지 제가 다 생리기 나로라 딘데기 규다 숨바지 여메디 따야디 개침부레스라 제가 단다 디나로라 곰기 마임바체네 미두주기 나로라 코란족이 개발지기 고네 아니 아일 기디 마와 인초고로 와 제가다 뜬데 릭디 가리네 카르소레 유체 니기 바라야나 케제 니기 바라라 뜬데 이나 뜬데 디기 준데 청고요 말와 따이네 준데 카르소레 곰갸와 디기 콘융도 땅와디 하코야기 체도 디템베 체야기 체도 아니 유체 숨바디 대와메바 임바직 땅 아주 땡고로 와디인디 안 마음베다 심주기 나로라 아니 디땡야기 아니 탑시세야다도 좀 그랬어.
We've got a minute or two. Is that clear? Any clarifying questions that anyone has or closing thoughts?
단다 까마치니지게 되서도 아니 디 세세 땡고야다 안데데 티와든데 요나스 디 마임베양 칸즈 탄돔야기 삼로든데.
Actually, we're just going to highlight one more point or two here, which is that everything that we've just done, which is to really unpack the question and the answer of these figures, is nicely summarized in the first paragraph of the discussion section.
따탄당 아주 리몰라타네 에네 리모디기 카르소레 티와 카레라 렌 땡게도 안디 렌디 카레 샤슬라니 디 쇠저라 디 차잔디 아니 니츠디 트두기 쳔베기 둠센 당보디 나로라 니 리기오레스.
So there's a few points to make here. First of all, if you're wanting to understand the take-home point of the results section of a research paper, that first paragraph of the discussion section can be very useful in giving you a very clear and clean summary of what the kind of overall findings are.
따디 되네 가시 쉬에 요번하로는 직디 아니 코 심주기 tumde와 강인바다 안 tumde 디네 아주 가소레 케르 투비아기 고도로디 가리임바디 하고야라스 아니 주두르 셈베 엔 톰생 당보딜라 시바이나 디 낭로라 아니 톰제 녜도용 가리임바다디 베 세부치니 요레스.
It also highlights that when you write your own papers, that first paragraph is pretty clear of what your goal is, which is just to remind the reader in a simplified, accessible way, what were the primary findings you had in your results section. That first paragraph of a discussion section is always going to be that clean, clear summary statement.
디게 넘버 2 수수게 제좀기 티베 값수 생리기 제좀 티베 값수 최도 셈바디기 동생 당보제로디 이 가두이네야 아니 심주기 녜된데 강세세 고대대치니 아니 티고요레스.
So maybe we can just read this together and just really see how this relates to the questions and answers that we posed in our walkthrough of the figures.
단지 가지고 레몰라 때네 아니 티와카지 가지고 디체로와 바게 샤버와 렌 또온디 티와도줄라 렌도주 딱딱 디 카르소레 디 컨데스 트도 쳔바나 용고여바디 신야라 아는 가라주 냠도디 로기인스.
So although no main effect of compassion meditation training on innate immune HPA axis or behavioral responses to a laboratory psychosocial stressor was found,
따디 낭로라 아니 닝지 곰바디기 로아 딜라테네 아니 가라주기 단데 르부 낭로라 세미에 최다 제베 값수 르부 낭로라 야렌 아니 카소레 야렌 트레단라스 아니 믹세기 코슈겐 게 녜메나야스.
that's perfectly maps onto that figure where we saw no group differences, right? This is a nice, clean summary statement of this figure here that shows no group differences in the compassion versus control group after TSST on those variables.
디게 가르던 거 도슬라나 단지 리모디 낭로라 루가니라 믹세 케바메바지 리모나라 세버와 디게 더 초돔 아니 듀부직 다다 차기도 왔어.
But then, as we noted, the researchers said, well, let's ask what's happening within the meditation group. So within the group of participants randomized to meditation training, we observed significant correlations. Good, they're using correlational language rather than causations. We have significant correlations between the amount of meditation practice and innate immune and behavioral responses to psychosocial stress.
데네 아니 고즈 모티네 가릴랍도 슬라바이나 이나야스 아니 곰 야켄기 아니 코라 루카기 낭로라스 라 아니 곰 야야기 아니 튜 망용기 아니 고네스 라 아니 곰기 아니 곰 야야기 튜조디다 아니 수구나로라다 저 카르소레 세시마루도에기 아니 바르라 안 튼데지여바 아주 녜송슬라니 데티도아스.
Okay, so you can now see how this paragraph, or not paragraph, this sentence or two maps directly on to figures 4, and we didn't go through figure 5, but it's the same direction of the finding, where they're summarizing right in the beginning of that paragraph of the discussion section exactly what we went through when we interpreted the figures.
디 탄데디 나로레 코바디 리무체바이나 리무시바다 단지 가주델라 십다체로아 리무시바다 리망아월 가주 따투여 말데 뒤니니기 뚠야기 된다체로아 된다디 아니 세부치네 따디나로라 가르소레 트두르셈베 아니 톰센 당분할 거여도 와스.
Just to take a moment, if I was to give the researchers in this study one piece of advice here, I would say to be clearer in their wording about the nature of the correlation, rather than to just say correlation in that summary statement.
따디나로라 게나 코랑기 따콘주 좀쇼 팅엔딜라 지 삼차도 지 퓨고여나 라 아니 가리 퓨사레슬라바이나 correlation 라네 식디 장바 샤바 마샤와 체네 correlation 가리 임바디 아니 세가 되나 야부도스라네 삼자트요사레스.
We're bumping into lunch, so under normal circumstances I would ask you to write this or say this, but I want to get you to lunch. But what we could say here is we observed that amongst individuals in the compassion training program, the more they practiced meditation, the lower their innate immunity was. And so what that provides the reader is more accessible language, and it describes the direction of the correlation as opposed to just saying correlation.
The number 2 결소래 제좀 티니 딘데지가라 심주디가라 제좀 티고고요나로와 아니 가족이 딜라네 곰 가족 마와자와 티츠기 라 IL6 기 체시디 마와두스라니 티바이나 직니 아니 코미규마츠 코디고 직체 니바디 두니니게 뜬데디 아니 독베 뜬데 임바디 코투고르와스.
And then lastly, they do a nice job of just saying in the end of the first paragraph, what wasn't significant in that compassion training group. So it's very clear what was and what wasn't significant, doing a nice job of rounding out that summary of the findings.
안디네 디낭로라 nenga 가르 첨부 유인디바 가리임바 nenga 메바디 가리임바 라디 세보지네 아니 응진체샤스.
Any announcements? Okay, great job. That was a fun exercise, and I think we've learned something, which is the more you meditate, you actually have to do the work in order to see the benefits. And I would say, in some respects, that's kind of like science. You know, you can learn about these things by reading textbooks and stuff, but what we're doing here is we're actually doing the work. We're learning how to do science by doing science, and that's really exciting. So have a great lunch. We'll see you at 3.
다든다 심주디기 녀든 쪼지 가래도 슬라바이나 곰도 우치기 누바 튀야라 곰디 갸고야디 뒤서 가져마 갸와 대서기 누바 튕겨봐지 튕겨도 와스 때디 체리나래 지과레스 로 체리나라라 되나마 겐라기 티디 녀엔데네 주고 대디기 체리 개신기 마레스 뭐 수박에 제고고요 레스 아니 진짜나로라다 가리나 아니 디 튼다디 튕겨도 손래 아니 아니 닝고 나 수지 페로나